Hello, and welcome to this episode. Kristen and I are really excited to be sharing a special project that we've been working on for several months. If you listen to the episode that we entitled Culinary Psychopomp, we talked about ancient Hekate Suppers and how we are doing a deep dive into all of the components of the supper and the meaning of the supper, and that is a big passion project that we've taken on that will take us at least a year, if not probably a few years, to get through all of these deep dives. So if you haven't yet listened or watched Culinary Psychopomp, I highly recommend you do that. You can do it before or after you listen and watch this one. It doesn't really matter. Today we are gathered together to discuss eggs. So eggs were part of ancient Hekate suppers. If you are a devotee of Hecate, you may already know that eggs are part of Hekate suppers, and they're typically like a raw whole egg. When we started unpacking these ancient Hekate suppers and asking, like, what did they mean to those who engaged in this ritual? And also, what did all of the ingredients in this supper specifically mean? When we started asking this question, it really like opened up a whole world of like research and rabbit holes. It's spring, so rabbits are hopping all around my property, and Kristen and I say, like, we love going down these historical rabbit holes to examine what Hecate's supper would have meant to those who actually performed this ritual in the ancients. So today we are cracking the mystery on eggs, why eggs were part of the supper, what eggs meant to those who would have been doing this meal, and why eggs were included. Talking about the themes associated with eggs, the symbolism. So eggs are very liminal. Eggs are also about purification. Eggs are also very nourishing. I think, Kristen, the really interesting thing about the eggs is that, so we've done cakes for Hecate and we've done fish for Hecate.
Right.
Which to me, they're kind of like the two showpieces of the meal.
Hmm.
Like, because we know like the fish was expensive and special, and
Right.
then cakes would have been special too. So we've done the two like big things, and now we're switching into eggs, which for me at least, because eggs are like my primary source of protein. So I eat a lot of eggs. Eggs are very much a part of my everyday life. And to the ancients,
Right.
it would have been the same thing. Like eggs were part of their everyday life.
Yep.
So I think that it's different. It's a demarcation from something that was special and unusual, like cake or fish, the type of fish they used, to something that was part of everyday life. And, it was just Easter here. So eggs as a symbol of rebirth are kind of like everywhere in our culture during the Easter season, right?
Mhm.
So they are often chocolate, at least in this house.
Same.
So we're gonna start. We've made little eggshell candles. So
So
these
I'll,
are really easy to make. You can just crack an eggshell and drop in. You can do it with the wax, or you can actually just do it by peeling the wrapper off of a little tea light and popping it in to make your own eggshell candles. So let's begin as we always do. And so it's interesting, we're talking about eggs and their symbolic understanding in the ancient world, the ancient Mediterranean. There was like this twofold. They were to purify and they were also protective. And that's what these ancient Hecate suppers were really about. So let's start with that counterclockwise circle of purification and cleansing. and then cast the circle clockwise to protect, connect. And that is exactly what the spirit of the ancient Hekate Suppers was this twofold functionality of protection from restless spirits and purification of the home and the body and so on. So I have for our invocation for today, comes from the Psychopomp chapter in Entering Hecate's Cave. Hail Hecate, she who stands at the threshold between the worlds. I bring you a fine meal, knowing that you intend it for the animals and the downtrodden. They, like me, are yours. I feel the restless dead and the haggard spirits gathered in this place. They, like me, are yours. I am embraced by the darkest night, for the moon has covered her face out of respect for you. They, like me, are yours. And that is my attempt to capture what my personal experience of bringing a Hecate's meal to a crossroads is, very much inspired by the ancient practices, and also mindful of, like, while there are many similarities between my modern understanding of Hecate and the ancients, there are also really important cultural differences in how, like, I understand death, the meaning of the crossroads, the element of risk. I live in the country; it's really quite safe for me to do this. So there's all these similarities and also differences. So going deep into, like, an anthropological examination of these Hekate suppers has really been deeply nourishing for me. I feel more connected, um, to the spirit of Hecate. I don't know. Do you agree with that, Kristen?
Absolutely agree with that. Yes.
So we
And
are going to, where are we starting
sorry,
today? Sorry, go ahead.
I'm sorry, Cindy. No, I was just gonna say something about the eggs, like being part of this everyday offering. This was sticking in my head. But they weren't any less important, right?
Yeah.
We were talking before we started about eggs as an archetype, and you were saying, well, what are eggs? And I was like, well, how do you break down the universe? You know? Yeah. So that, yeah, there's such a depth to it. I don't know.
Yeah, then there's so much symbolism even today, because one of the key questions that we ask when we do these deep dives into an aspect of historical practice involving Hecate or another goddess, or we're unraveling a myth or something, we always ask, like, how is this, or is this still alive in the popular culture today?
Right.
So, like, we've done, like, when I did this series last year with Angela, and we did several goddesses and their mythology, it's like, well, where do we still see this today? Or has it vanished from pop culture? And like you said, like, eggs are the universe. Like, they're a symbol of the universe. Everybody knows, that they're a symbol of rebirth, coming in connection with Easter. So, and then all of the different cultures, which we're going to touch on, like, at the very end, like the different ways of making fancy Easter eggs. Like, eggs are such a universal symbol.
Yeah.
So they're also like, there's something that's part of our diet in so many ways, like, so incorporated into the Western diet, right? Like, bread has eggs in it, cakes have, everything has eggs in it, or we're eating eggs, like, and at the same time, like, there is this really rich, symbolic, spiritual energy to an egg.
Right.
When I asked, like, what is an egg? And you were like, that is, like, the hardest question. I was like, well, what is an egg? I mean, we know, like, nutritionally what an egg is, but, like, an egg is also, like, just a special part of life.
Yeah.
Even for
Um,
us that aren't farmers and don't, have our own eggs, like we're not a part of the whole like cycle of life in terms of, collecting eggs and managing like chickens or ducks or goose or whoever is laying the eggs. Like still like eggs have that kind of specialness to them. There's something deeper about the very common egg. Does that make sense to you?
yeah, that makes so much sense. Eggs are like, to me, I kind of see eggs as temenos,
Mm.
right? And to bring it back to what you said about like seeing this from an ancient lens, I think about, especially the ancient Greeks, how they associated eggs with the underworld. Like they were very liminal, you know, and purifactory, like you said, and protective. And yeah.
And so we've got a lot of history to kind of piece together as we crack a little bit into this mystery about why eggs, specifically raw eggs, were included in ancient Hekate suppers. So the first challenge we had, I feel like this was a series of gates. Like I feel like this was, it was almost like I could feel like Hecate smiling and saying, like, if you want to know about the eggs, there are a series of research gates you're going to need to pass through. And each one was a challenge. So the very first challenge was that although it is written in many places, I've written about it in my books, that eggs were included in a Hecate supper in ancient times, and that you might want to do it today. It's written many, many places. Trying to suss out the specific ancient sources that said that a Hecate supper included eggs turned out to be quite a challenge. So one of my favorite source books is a book that's no longer in print called The Goddess Hecate by Stephan Ronan. I think it came out in the 90s. And
Mhm.
so this is where I would have gotten this information from, that the eggs were part of this meal. And looking in his book, like at the citations, he he used this kind of shorthand for his citations that I'm not a classical scholar, so it can take me a bit to kind of figure out even like what the citation actually says when I kind of take, to figure out what their shorthand meant. So that was the first challenge, is like trying to find the source for the information regarding including eggs in her supper. So the goddess Hecate led me on a loop-de-loop, kind of almost like Hecate's wheel labyrinth, trying to find the original source. Kristen is always happy to take my hand when I say we're going, like, this is not an easy, some things about Hecate are very easy to kind of source. And some things are very difficult. And so Kristen took my hand and we lit the torches and off we went to try to piece together where ancient Greeks or Romans actually said a Hecate's supper included eggs. We've come back in one piece from hanging out with Lucian of Samosata. So good old Lucian of Samosata, who lived in the early part of the Common Era, was a satirist, so kind of like the John Oliver of his day. And
Mhm.
although there may be other sources that specifically say eggs, and I'm talking about ancient Greek or Roman sources, that eggs were included in Hecate's supper. This is the one that I think we both believe is where certainly Ronan pulled
Yeah.
his description of a Hecate supper from. And
Hmm.
then Ronan's book, even though it's out of print, has been super influential in what is commonly written about Hecate
Hmm.
today. Okay, so Lucian, good old Lucian of Samosata, satirist, funny guy, wrote funny stories, and so on. So this is where specifically you get the reference to a Hecate supper, including eggs. So we've included this here. Um, just and we'll make sure we put a link to view the PDF of the slides for anyone who wants to go deeper and actually look at all of our source material. And it comes from Dialogues of the Dead, most fitting, because at this time specifically, around the beginning of the Common Era, Hecate was really associated with the dead, with crossroads, the liminal spaces, and her earlier kind of more like great mother goddess energy had really, like in the common, like for most of the ancient world, had really she'd become associated with crossroads, the liminal, the dead, and so on, and miasma, like purification. So it's fitting that it's in the Dialogues of the Dead. So there is this quote that says, one of the speakers, this fella is speaking to this other guy, and he says to talk about, he's talking about leaving a Hecate's repast or meal laying at a street corner. And it kind of goes on, we're pulling this out of context, but if you can find this whole Dialogues of the Dead, you can Google it and find it online. It's public domain, so you can read it yourself. So this is where we believe it comes from. But there was a really interesting question that came from one of the footnotes when we were reading this, which is this business with lustral eggs. So Kristen, maybe you can talk a little bit about the lustral eggs business.
Right. Well, first I want to say, maybe I want to say this about Lucian of Samosata being a satirist and this being like the loop-de-loop that we went through to find this information, Cindy.
Right?
So lustral eggs is kind of like lustral water, like holy water or Kernit's water, or it's used for purification. And like I said, there's something there that I'm still trying to put my finger on, that eggs were associated with the underworld. And I try to imagine this from like an ancient perspective. And when you crack the egg, it looks like water, and the yolk is in the center, and the yolk was associated with sulfur, and sulfur was associated with the soul. And so it makes sense that this would be a vessel for like purification to collect miasma. So yeah,
And
lustral
also
just means basically.
Sorry, go ahead.
Lustral is just basically like holy and cleansing, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Purificatory.
Yeah.
So, and I think, like you said, in their understanding, like eggs were chthonic, they represented the liminal and also the underworld. And we'll be talking more about that. Like there's evidence of eggs being used in burials. And, so there's this element that eggs are associated with death. And I think one of the things that we've been talking about is that like an egg, I have lots of eggs here, like, like an egg is like when we take it and so it can be consumed as food, it is like a life that never gets to happen. Like, even though we see eggs as this powerful symbol of rebirth, it's actually like a death, because the bird that would have resulted naturally from the egg, we've interrupted it. So in a sense, it, like, to me, if we think about the ancient world, like how connected they were to like where food came from, they didn't just go to the supermarket to get eggs. It's like they would have been aware, like to consume an egg is basically to consume something that has died. Or never got to have life, right? Does that make sense?
Right. Yeah, that makes perfect sense.
And I think like in modern life where we're not so connected to like where our food comes from, it's easy to forget. Like chickens don't just lay eggs for us. Like it's part of their natural thing to lay eggs and have more chickens. But we take them to eat them, which is fine. I'm not anti-egg. I am just saying, like, in the ancient world, that awareness of what was involved in claiming eggs to eat as opposed to like letting them become chickens
Right. Like this was a primary source of nourishment. And like you said, the chickens lay the eggs, and that's how you get more chickens, right? Like you're not going to the grocery store picking up a dozen eggs.
Right.
Right. This was your food source.
And if you take the egg from the chicken to eat the eggs, then like you're not going to get a chicken that you can butcher and eat later on.
Right. Right.
So there's a lot of underworld energy around the innocent looking egg. And you know, it makes sense. Like when I ask the question, like, well, why would they think eggs were so chthonic? It's because, like, yeah, when you think, what is an egg? That is what an egg is.
Mm-hmm.
It's more than just an omelet. This is also where I had heard this quote before, and I think you heard this quote before about rich men used to make offerings to Hecate on the 30th of the month as goddess of roads at street corners, and these offerings were at once pounced upon by the poor, or as here, the cynics.
Mm-hmm.
And again, keeping in mind that this particular passage, like it's coming from a satire.
Mm-hmm.
And it's used, you know, like it's used in a certain way to kind of maybe get a laugh or to make the reader audience think,
Mm-hmm.
like, did the poor actually pounce upon it? Because that would have been like contrary to what we've discovered was actually the practice with leaving these meals to Hecate. So let's get a little deeper, but that's where we think that is like the main source we found that talks about the eggs is in this satire. Mm-hmm. So let's break down about like why offerings and why, you know, why were these things offered to Hecate specifically? So keeping in mind that Hecate was so associated with liminal spaces and the crossroads of life and death. So she has this association with the dead, and specifically with the restless dead, and also like spirits, ghosts, all those kinds of things. At this time in the ancient world, this is really how Hecate is understood by some people. So I looked in Sarah Johnson's book on the Restless Dead to kind of say, what is the context for these suppers? Like, I don't think these suppers were just something that came out of the blue. Usually, anything we do, there is kind of like an etiology that leads us to that practice. So indeed, with this Hekate supper, there was a practice of taking a supper to the dead. So there were the Deipnon rituals to Hecate, and then there's also this idea of taking a supper to the dead. And they were called, and if they were well pleased by it, they were called the Deipnoi, which means like basically well-fed supper. You had a good supper. Mm-hmm. So it reflects the hope that once nourished, the dead would realize that they had nothing to complain about. So these meals to the dead were meant to keep them happy and to keep them from interfering in everyday life. And I think that's very much what part of what the ancient Hekate suppers were about too, is if you brought these meals to Hecate, it was like bringing a meal to the dead, and she would make sure that the problematic dead, the spirits, the ghosts, would not fuss with you for the coming month. So I think we've talked about this a lot, why we've been doing this whole Hekate supper project. It's kind of lands on like how different the ancients who performed this ritual, how different they understood death than we do today. Like death was part of their everyday life.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I don't like, it's not part of my everyday life.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, when I started to think about it, like eggs, well, you know, like you could see, like, yes, it still is, but in an obvious way.
Mm-hmm.
And if you eat, like, if, you know, if a person eats like animal flesh, then that death is part of their everyday life too. But it's just this whole thing about in modern life, we're really disconnected from death. And that makes us very different from how those who were involved in ancient Hekate Supper would have experienced death. Like death would have been just part of life.
Right. Right. And a side note, I think about a lot of times this was apotropaic or sort of honoring the restless dead, or like maybe what was perceived as like evil spirits. That also a lot of times it was like you know, like you said, the dead were part of death was a part of everyday life. And I think that a lot of people believe that the dead were with them. And you can read, and I think it may be in the slides here, that often they were offered like water and stuff to like cleanse themselves. And like that's another link that would tie it back to the purifactory egg left as offering. Um, so yeah, it's really fascinating to think about.
It is, right? Like in how different, like again in mainstream culture, how different our relationship is with the dead. Like, you know, and how like I would never think of taking water to like my father's grave.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, there's all these different practices that we have today compared to then. But we still have the prime need of purifying ourselves and
Mm-hmm.
protecting ourselves from bad things. So that hasn't changed, but how it looks, I think, has really changed.
Right.
Kristen, you also already mentioned what I think is the one key word for this whole session we're doing here, which is apotropaic, which
Yeah.
means it it's intended to ward off evil. So Hecate suppers were apotropaic. They were intended to keep bad spirits, restless dead, away from the people who did these rituals. And they were also um, lustral or purificatory in that
Right.
there was a significant amount of purification involved in this. So there's this twofold thing where there needs to be purification first, and then there is this protection element.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're interested in diving deep into this, again, the Restless Dead book by Sarah Johnson really goes into detail about this. Let's just read a little passage of what she's got here. As Hecate was a goddess credited with the power either to hold back the unhappy dead or to drive them on against an unlucky individual, hoi apotropaioi surely refers here to the dangerous ghosts of the dead. Offering these suppers to both the dead and their mistress guaranteed not only that the dead would be fed and appeased, but also that Hecate would help keep them under control. The timing reflects a belief that souls were especially likely to be abroad on the night of the new moon. And that's an important point because in some of the translations, it'll say like the 30th of the month. And I think that's like just it's like a mistranslation because their calendar was lunar.
Mm-hmm.
So the end of the month for them wasn't like the 30th of the month, like the calendar month. It was like when the moon was invisible.
Right.
If one wanted to do something to appease them, this was the easiest and also the most necessary time to make contact. So very important there. The business of why Hecate suppers occurred on the new moon, because there was this belief that the restless dead were especially active during the new moon, which is interesting when you think about it today, because I guess the analog belief to that today would be like that full moons make people crazy.
Yeah. Well, I also think about just a sort of a fear of darkness, though, right? Like the scary things lurk in the dark.
Right. So then we went into this book about Plutarch. Plutarch had a lot to say about Hecate in different passages. So we looked at this huge, like it's a compendium of academics contributing lengthy essays on different aspects of Plutarch's work. And there is a chapter in that on Plutarch's view of Hecate. Now, Plutarch also wrote about Hekate Suppers. So we wanted to kind of unpack this a little bit. And one note we wanted to make from reading this, so of course it repeats the apotropaic aspect, repeats that they were done on the new moon, and also explicitly Dr. Carrasco discusses like the Hecatea, which is something I think we should introduce to this discussion now too. So the Hecatea or the Hecateon, these were shrines. I don't have one on this slide. There's one here. You can see them. There's one there. These were shrines that people would have at the threshold to their houses, as in like individual families. And then they would also be like at like the city limits. So at those crossroads where so these were statues of Hecate. Like Hermes was also very commonly like involved in a similar way. And so the Hekate Supper, when they were done at the household level, were most likely left in front of a little Hecateon to her. And then at the crossroads, there may well have been larger statues there.
Right.
What else does Plutarch have to say? So Plutarch, in this essay, the author says that there is this dividing line between Hekate Suppers, like kind of before the time around the start of the Common Era, and then as we approach the Common Era in the early days of Christianity, that earlier Hekate Suppers were not to be consumed.
Mm-hmm.
And then something happened, and there was the quote about poor people eating Hekate Suppers. So whether or not there actually was a shift in how it was practiced, or if it's just something that an author said, we'll never know, of course. But this really led us to an interesting conversation about how different Hekate Suppers were compared to how most of the other deities were propitiated, like during this time, which I think is something really important. Mm-hmm. So in this essay, it's pointed out that Plutarch made the note that the ritual for Hecate was real food, and it was placed at the crossroads, and that it wasn't to be eaten or burnt, like so for some of the other deities, like food offerings could be eaten, or sometimes they were burnt in a symbolic gesture, but Hecate had none of this. And this links back to what Johnson was saying in her book, where she points out that the Hecate Suppers were really different and that they were not connected to like the state, like they weren't like an official part of the calendar. And this kind of reinforces that. It's like, so these were something different. Like you didn't do a Hecate Supper like you did other propitiations to the gods. It was something different. It was done at the household level. It wasn't kind of in a temple. It wasn't part of the state. And you also treated the food differently. So I don't know, it seems to me that it's revealing this, like that Hecate was truly an outsider. Like she was never part of the Olympics, like never part of Zeus and everybody. She was older and different, and yet also important. Like, and then you think about, there were these like Hecateons, like these shrines at important crossroads and also in households. And then there was these suppers, but all of this is kind of functioning like outside of officialdom.
Right. It's funny. I think what makes this so complex is that this is also could be like two sides of the same coin, because that the state, how do you say this? She was honored like on a state level, but then you have like the household offerings, and yeah, point left my brain, Cindy.
Okay. So let's see some more. Let's
Um,
read some more what Dr. Carrasco has to say, and let's did the point come back?
yes, I'm back. So, and there's this whole thing with like, where's the crossroads between these apotropaic offerings and propitiation, and then like Hecate as guardian of the marginalized, and then like Hecate's word, and like where does all of this stuff meet? Um, that's my question.
That's such a good question because like the leaving of these offerings at the crossroads and in the ancient world, like the crossroads were not only like a spiritual place where you were likely to run into like unfriendly ghosts, but they were also
Mhm.
like associated with like the kind of like the margins of a town or city. And that was
Right.
also, from what I understand, was also where like people who couldn't have a proper burial for whatever reason, like unwed mothers or murderers or whoever, they couldn't be buried like in the main graveyards.
Mhm.
Um, that they would be buried like near these crossroads as well. So there's that whole element, to the whole thing, right? That you can't take the dead out of these Hekate suppers because the dead is such a big part, would have been such a big part of why they were
Right. If you look at it on a bigger level, like, and you think about looking at it on a state level, I can imagine like these apotropaic offerings might be made to like sort of to protect the community, but then on a smaller level, you have like your little, household shrines where you just, like it maybe it was a more common thing, like a daily thing and not a monthly thing where you just like make your little propitiation, you make your little offerings. I don't know, but it's really fascinating. It's really fascinating to me.
it's really fascinating to me as well. There was a part of this I wanted to read. So in the essay, the author talks about like Hecate having like a philanthropic side and then her scary side. So Hecate can like bestow things and also is super scary because she's in charge of these ghosts and whatnot.
Right.
So she's threatening slash protective and also philanthropic. So she has this complexity, which is certainly personally how I like understand her today, like this complexity. But to the ancients, she would have had this complexity as well. Been both like the one who can bring the horde to you and also the one that would protect you from the horde,
Right.
which I
Right.
think
But
is
back to
really
the
interesting.
two sides of the coin there, you know?
And we might at some future point do a whole episode on dogs and how they were involved in Hecate suppers, because we know it is like an unsettling part of Hecate supper that people might not be comfortable like hearing about. But just to talk about the purification part of these suppers, it was very like part of the suppers was a deeply like purific purificatory ritual that involved the slaughtering of puppies. And of course, we don't endorse the slaughtering of puppies, but they
Right.
had a really different relationship with death and
Right.
animals than we do today. And, that was a huge part of the purification part of this ritual.
Mhm.
So I think we need to at least mention that.
Right.
I mean, today we do purification in different ways. Like, you can purify yourself with an egg. There's lots you could do, and certainly the eggs most likely were part of like that purification, why they were left as part of her supper. But there was also this
Mhm.
really disturbing part of this ritual, in terms of the, animal sacrifice.
Right.
Just to kind of reiterate, like how different their relationship was with death, um, than ours is today. Here's another Hecateon from the Met in New York City. I've seen that one. with my own eyes. So here, and we're sticking with that same essay on Plutarch's understanding of Hecate. We get into the idea of basically putting garbage, or what I always think of it more as like compost, because they wouldn't have had, like, they didn't have like plastic wrap and takeout
Right.
boxes.
Right.
So it would have been more like, what we put in the compost today, like taking that, and that's another part of Hecate's suppers,
Right.
which is another kind of, I mean, it's not nearly as disturbing as like puppies being sacrificed, but it's also like, in the past when I've mentioned this, people have said, well, why would I ever give garbage to Hecate? And it's this whole like lustral, like cleansing process, like to give her your garbage, like it was a suitable offering for a goddess who was very much consumed with like dealing with pollution
Right.
or miasma. So that was also a part. So there's kind of like, there's multiple parts to the Hecate supper ritual, which is one is the actual taking this special meal to the crossroads. There is the purification that goes on before you would do that, which includes like animal slaughter and collecting household waste. So this was a very involved experience. It wasn't just putting a bunch of stuff on a plate and making a charcuterie board and dropping it off at the crossroads. It was a long process that would take several hours.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's a really interesting, sticking with this same essay, there's some interesting notes um, about the author's take on why Hecate was associated with both like Aletheia, like a divine midwife, and also all of her death and filth eating aspects, and that this is like that she feels like that Hecate would have been understood as a goddess very much like who was involved in like cleansing of pollution or miasma, and that both like coming into this world and leaving this world are liminal times. Like the egg is a liminal thing that represents both, right? It is something that has just come into this world, and at the same time, there is a life that never happened because it became food.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is something that, I don't know, this really has a lot of like vibrancy for me. This idea that Hecate is like this, she's a liminal spirit. Like she never occupies like one place, like, but she is always between life and death. Like she's never on the side of life and she's never entirely on the side of death. She is always in this space between the two, which even if you think of like the Persephone myth, she's between the two. Like she comes out of her cave and she helps Persephone go down to the underworld. And so this is a really specific type of death goddess energy, because she's not like bringing death to people. She's not like she's an Anassa Eneroi, queen of the dead, but it's not like she's Persephone on her throne, like sitting over the souls. It's like she's always about the in-between, and any souls that kind of get caught in the in-between, because that was an important idea to the ancients too, about the ones who didn't have a good death would become these restless spirits and couldn't go on to the under, they'd be kind of like trapped, almost like
Purgatory.
purgatory. Yeah, almost like a purgatory.
Yeah.
And because ancient curse tablets are wonderful, I wanted to bring in an ancient curse tablet just to kind of reinforce like that Hecate was associated with death and how they understood like ritual and magic at this time. So this is a curse tablet that is to three chthonic deities, Hecate, Artemis, and Hermes. And it is a really great curse tablet that you might be tempted to use yourself. Um, but it is this linking of cursing with the dead, and that there are several examples of Hecate being invoked in these existing curse tablets. And a lot of them, like, it's like the dead are a source of um, this kind of like harmful or baneful magic that you can kind of enlist Hecate's horde of restless spirits to curse
Mhm.
people, which again I think is really different than when I think of like, popular psychics today. Like, I don't know, there's like some psychics that are on television. There's one fellow who's like a young man, and I've
Uh,
watched, I don't know if you've ever watched this fella, but like all of them,
uh,
almost all of the messages he brings from dead people are like good ones. Like the dead people he talks to are not problematic.
right,
And
right.
then you kind of look at like ancestral healing. Like we know, I'm thinking of like Mark Wolyn's work on like ancestral healing, like from a psychological perspective.
Hmm.
And like we know the dead are problematic. Like
Right,
we know what happened in our own ancestry is often very off, like it can be very beneficial and got us to where we are today. And at the same time, like there can be like a lot of intergenerational trauma transmission, like through our DNA. It doesn't need to be expressed. So it's like the dead are problematic in many
right.
ways.
Well, this is part of that concept of the restless dead. Like, they have their own baggage, you know?
And sometimes we can think like, oh, well, they were such a superstitious lot back then. And of course, like there's not restless dead, who can help us with curse spells, or, restless dead that need to be appeased every month. But like I think it's just like a metaphor for like the work of people like Mark Wolyn and others, that we have these, that the dead have caused us a lot of problems. And in a way,
Right.
in a psychological sense, they can still be very much with us. I think it's almost, to me, I see like it's a very parallel idea without the supernatural business.
Hmm.
But there is a very like kind of mysterious aspect to it. It's like, when you think of the research done on the children and grandchildren and great grandchildren of Holocaust survivors, and like these were Holocaust survivors who never ever talked about what happened to them, and yet, you know, their um, their offspring like can have these memories or even have like
Right,
physical symptoms and ailments.
right.
So it's like, I don't really think that this was so superstitious and that they were just like primitive people and, thought ghosts were out to get them. I think this is something that's very real to us. Like the dead, there are restless dead that cause us problems.
Right. It's back to bring it back to their relationship with the dead. And I think us, I don't know, I think most of us, it's a very sort of sanitized thing. And I can't really express how or why, but I know me personally, like I've just kind of always, I grew up having this idea that like when somebody passes, maybe they like get all of the answers and like, they're cured of the things and grandpa's not an asshole anymore. And you know what I'm saying? But I think that I would imagine they're just very much like people, like everyday people, the everyday dead, right?
Yeah. Like, and I think they had that, like, you're right. It's like, well, they've gone to heaven now. So they're, and it's so beautiful, right? It's like, well, you die and you go to heaven. Or if you're polluted, if you're full of miasma and you didn't do your purification and by becoming a good Christian and you go to hell, like that's bad. I guess that would be the restless dead, but we don't like to think of after people die, we don't like to think anybody went to hell.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know. I'm glad you brought that in because I think that's we have a funny kind of relationship with death today, in that we try to just like
Yeah.
keep it away from us. And when
Right.
it does happen to us, like the grieving process
Mm-hmm.
is, it's also like people don't want to talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
Like other people who aren't going through grief, if you are like grieving for the loss of someone, we don't have a lot, like there's not a good sense of like, how do I talk to them about their grief? Like we really struggle with death.
Right. You're gonna seek comfort, like you're not gonna want to ask the hard questions. Um,
And I kind of like, like in terms of like doing an ancient Hekate supper, like with the intention, like this will appease any restless spirits, whether they're in my family or they're just wandering the streets of the village where I live. Like to me, it
right.
seems so like cathartic.
Mm-hmm.
Like
Oh
if I
yeah.
do have grief, if my dad is like showing up in my dreams every night,
Mm-hmm.
doing this ritual might like give me some calm in the dream time even.
Right. Right.
It's so interesting, right? Like this whole like why would they do something like this? Um, so now we're gonna kind of shift from the broader perspective of like what was a Hecate supper all about and why might they have done it, to really talking about the importance of purification. So we've talked a lot about the idea of the cleansing of pollution, that was a huge part of this. Hecate could cleanse you of pollution and protect you. So eggs specifically have this really rich history of being used in the same way. And there is this great book called Miasma, Pollution and Purification in Early Greek Religion, that was published in the 90s, that we really used as a source book to help us understand how the ancient Greeks would have understood eggs. And our word, if apotropaic and lustral are two of the key words that we've thrown around, we have a new one, eschatological, which means it concerns death, but also it's more of a theological perspective towards death. So eschatological is our third keyword for this talk. I think the big thing that you and I maybe went in was thinking that we could find an answer to why eggs.
Right.
We found this book, and in this book, Parker even says we don't know why. And we don't know specifically what they did with them.
But we're closer to understanding.
But we're closer to understanding. So some of the things that he talks about that are known is that the commonest. So we're just going to read a few points from these slides from this book. The commonest substance into which evil was transferred by a process that is nowhere made explicit was the egg. And so including that in Hecate's supper makes a lot of sense, because in their understanding, in religion, the egg was about a place where evil landed. So whether you like it was, you took the egg and perhaps they did like an egg cleanse for themselves first with it, we don't know. But like that the egg itself somehow, although the exact like rituals that were done, the egg itself was like a trap for evil spirits, which I think is so interesting.
Yeah.
Do you think it was like it might have had something to do with like the egg is life averted, so there's like an emptiness to the egg?
I don't know. This is one of those rabbit holes that I haven't quite climbed out of. Like if you think about lustral eggs, the whole concept of like lustral water, lustral eggs is that they are by nature like purif purifying.
Yeah.
And that like they can't be tainted. But then on the flip side of that, you think about like an egg as like temenos or a sacred space, or like the shell as a boundary and or the egg as a vessel. And it's like, can they also trap and hold this miasma? Right?
Right, because it's like it's a contained thing.
Yeah.
And like the shell is hard, but it's also like permeable. Like
Right.
like the physical structure of an egg. I really like where you're going with that. Like there's that aspect of it too.
Right. Well, it's the concept to, I mean, bring it back to sort of like the proverbial black sheep where you transfer your miasma onto the thing, you know, and it would make sense that it would just be trapped in there. So,
So this book talks about all of the different things that were used in purification, um, and includes like the. So I'll just read this little section. Diphilus melampus employs torch, squill, pitch, sulfur, and seawater all together, and other texts show a similar profusion. The rites were accompanied by incantations, which probably comprised of formulas of transference. May the evil pass into this egg. An analogy, as I wash off this mud, so may, as well as more mysterious matters. Expressions sometimes occur which suggest that an incantation could be a purification in itself. So there is this whole business about like evil, like a simple incantation into the egg where evil would pass into it. And again, thinking back like that, Hecate was not evil herself, but she was associated with being able to control evil spirits.
mm-hmm.
So it's like, okay, there's makes more sense. Why eggs? Because eggs would have been known in religious practice as having this very specific functionality.
Can I say something else to support this? If you look at the bottom right, we're coming back to Lucian, the satirist, saying after use, the cathartic eggs were still edible, which, like you said, satire, like that, maybe like a very tongue-in-cheek comment and support the fact that they were vessels for miasma.
Yeah, and like what would have Lucian meant by that? But like you said, it was satire. It was meant to be comedy.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like you've done this purification where you've transferred miasma pollution into the egg, whether it's from like your own self, your home, or like evil spirits. Um, and then he's saying like, oh, you can eat the cathartic egg. You can eat the egg that has all of this energy in it, but I don't know if he would have been serious about that.
I think it was probably a joke.
It could be like if someone was so pompous and pious, it was like, like when people say like so and so shit doesn't stink,
Mm-hmm.
it could kind of be like, oh yeah, you could eat that
Yeah.
egg full of miasma and whatnot, because aren't you just so holy and precious?
Right. Yeah.
It could be that kind of thing. Um, what else do we have in this book? So there's lots of detailed descriptions about doing things that I would never think of doing. But of course, Plato has to get involved in this conversation at some point. So he does talk about the doctrine of Plato, and this idea of cleansing and purity. And this really was a big idea, a really important idea, like in this era in ancient Greece. The
Mm-hmm.
Romans, of course, carried on this idea, like being pure, like whether it's,
Yeah.
bathing or transferring miasma into eggs or a blood ritual to cleanse the house, like whatever was going on, this idea of purification was really central to spiritual practice back then.
Mm-hmm.
And you and I have talked about like if this is like something that's archetypal, that humans have a need to purify in both like a physical, like let's clean the house, and spiritual sense, like where is that in kind of mainstream culture today. And I said something that kind of got a gasp out of you. I said, I think maybe it's dieting.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Because this whole idea like that fat is like miasma or pollution, and we do
Right.
all of these ridiculous things to get it out of our bodies.
Right. That it's gross or something.
Yeah, that it's gross. You know what I mean? That it's not acceptable, and that if you have this, it's like fat is like miasma. That you're not clean, you're not right. I mean, of course, fat isn't miasma. Like it's just genetics for the most part. Um, but I don't know. It'd be interesting to hear what people think about that. Like, is
Yeah.
fat the new miasma, and is dieting the new way of like pure, like where this energy of excessive purification
Hmm.
really is coming through? If we think like purification is an archetype, so it has a consciousness and it has a drive, and it will always present itself in humanity in different ways, and it'll be really important. Like, I don't know. I think like we have a lot of purification issues like in our
I agree.
society today about looking perfect, like looking a certain way. But I think
Hmm.
dieting is really about trying to purify yourself of fat.
Right. You're right. It's such a light bulb moment.
I am interested to see what everyone thinks about that idea. Okay, so Plato, obsessed with purity. So we're moving through, there's this business. Eggs are associated with purity because they help you remove the pollution, the miasma, and they can also be like little spirit traps for evil ghosts, and also highly nutritious and part of the everyday diet. Okay, so you had some more notes from this book. Oh, you know what? I wanted to talk about this book because we're going somewhere with this. Is like
Yeah.
the whole Orphic salvation thing, which, if you're interested in reading more about that, there isn't anything really on how, like Hecate Sotera, Hecate Sotera, Sotera means savior, but that was an epithet of hers. There, there isn't a lot, like that doesn't really intersect with this Orphic business. But if you're interested in like Orphic religious practices, it was super influential in early, like the Romans did things with it and kind of adapted it. And then it really kind of formed the basis of early Christianity and things that we still, it's still part of culture today in terms of that. So the Orphics are super important, but we're not getting into them. But the but Orphics actually thought like that you shouldn't eat eggs
Mhm.
because of the whole business we've already talked about. So that's really interesting. And I wanted to highlight that because there is this like complex thing with not eating anything from animals.
Mhm.
And I think for people, like we're talking about a traditional Hekate supper, and almost everything in the meal has an animal origin. Like there's
Right.
fish, the cakes, which were made with like cheese and honey and milk and eggs. And now we're doing eggs. And then we're doing cheese. I think we're going to choose cheese next.
Right.
So, but it's not to say there wasn't a movement towards what we might call veganism today and abstaining from anything from animals. And the Orphics were really into that,
Mhm.
um, into this kind of abstinence. So I think that's interesting. And even in the Eleusinian mysteries, like the fish that was really central to the Hecate supper, the red mullet, like people would abstain from that. So people before religious rituals would abstain from things like eggs and certain fish and meat. Um,
Mhm.
so it could also be, and we'll talk more about this, like this Lenten practice of a Hecate supper, like at the end of the month, like if you look at the ingredients of it, like all of that purification, and then whether or not you consume the supper yourself, it would be a really rich meal if you had been going through a period of abstinence for purification. Like there's cake, honey, garum or vinegar. Like there's all these
Right.
things in it. It's a really rich meal for, so if you had it in your own home, like as a family meal,
Mm-hmm.
after a period of abstinence, it would, I don't know, it makes a lot of sense to me that there was somehow something that we don't know, that there was a period of abstinence um, before these Hekate suppers.
Right. I think there's something there. And also this idea that maybe, like we've said before, times were different. And, I think most food sources probably were um, animal related. And it would be like a real sacrifice or like a real devotional act to like cut that out of your diet.
I think that's such a good point. And the Orphics indeed, and like there's evidence that, in preparing for the Eleusinian Mysteries, which were the seasonal like that rebirth series that involved Demeter, Persephone, and Hecate, that, like to do this, to abstain, to eat an animal-free diet, like it would have been a great act of will.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't like you just went to the supermarket and bought vegan products,
Right.
because their whole diet was really focused around animals,
Mm-hmm.
whether cheese and milk and eggs, and it would have really taken some effort. Even the way they would have prepared food, animals would have been involved in, in dishes that were only vegetables, but animals were usually involved some way.
Right. Well, there's something else too that's coming up for me that I'll say. Do you think that there's any connection uh to a lot of these things being chthonic? Like we've talked about the red mullet before. The red mullet was a bottom feeder and it was like a very chthonic fish. And I know that the ancient Greeks saw eggs as chthonic. And I think that there's like a thread there that I'd like to hear your opinion on it.
Like that. And I think, I don't know, this is so interesting. It's like a we're pulling up to the salad bar. It's like an inch instead of a sidebar, it's a salad bar. Like it's really interesting, like that piety and purity and like Uranic or celestial, like heavenly, which
Yeah.
to them the heavens were like where the gods, like like the Olympic deities hung out. Like that kind of ascension mentality, like that Plato, I think, spoke about, and that certainly in Orphism would have been important. Like, is this transmigration, like the soul is going somewhere, in that through abstaining from chthonic things, like things of the
Mm-hmm.
earth. Like, chthonic means of the earth, which is weird that
Mm-hmm.
it's not applied to vegetables, but let's just stay with that
Right.
idea for a minute. Um, but that animals were chthonic, but vegetables were not.
Yeah.
Um, and this whole, even today, in different, like I'm thinking of like maybe Christian monks or other monks who live like a very simple life and have a very simple diet. Like it's kind of like a continuance of that.
Mm-hmm.
And then like even the popularity of modern veganism as a form of purification, like in getting all the toxins out of your body from an animal-based diet.
Mm-hmm.
Like you can kind of see like this is still something that's with us. This idea that animal products are chthonic and therefore to do with the underworld,
Mm-hmm.
and perhaps like things that need to be abstained from.
Mm-hmm. Well, they're also associated with like death and suffering. Um,
Right. And so it's like if you want to be focused on like purity and ascension, um, like to disconnect yourself with from death and suffering. I think that's probably why vegetables aren't chthonic, because no one has to
yeah,
die for them.
that would make sense.
Vegetables and grains would not be chthonic. Okay. You wanted to include this footnote from the book. What were your thoughts on this footnote?
I did. So you're gonna get to this later, I think, with we may have to come back to this with the lustral eggs thrown into a fountain or a well. Um, and I think you did some research on this, but I noticed that there's a little footnote here, and this was the Robert Parker book. And it says something along the lines of, catharmos is a word that we haven't brought up that basically means like a deep, deep cleansing. And so this says catharmata, uh, thrown into a fountain at, how do you say this, Cindy? Lousoi, Lusoi.
Yeah, that's how I would say it.
Yeah, when all who drink from it hate wine. I don't. There's just something about the egg in the fountain, and like, is that a lustral thing? Is that a purification thing? Like, what is that? But I just wanted to highlight it because I know it's going to come up again later on in the slides.
Definitely. And also like wells as being these portals to the underworld. And so
Right.
like you would throw an egg that was lustral, so perhaps it had already been involved in some kind of like purification or apotropaic rite, and then you would throw it in the well. And then if you drank from this well, like those people who were kind of committed to like the Orphic life, basically, like, that
Right.
they were abstaining. We would call it like they were committed to sobriety, or, committed to veganism. Like
Right.
it was really kind of
Right.
multi-pronged, the Orphic life. So this
Right.
whole idea, like you don't drink wine, and you're what do we call it today? Like straight edge, right? Or straight, like a
Yeah.
straight edge vegan, like you don't do any of this stuff.
Right.
Um,
So yeah, I think this is like drink from that well and be cleansed kind of
yeah.
thing.
Which again, there's that double idea that you throw the thing in there that contains the miasma, and somehow like the well has magical powers that like amplify the cleansing power of the egg, but that like the miasma contained in the egg, like it never kind of pollutes the water, which I find kind of confusing.
It's a little confusing.
Okay, let's move on. We could spend like weeks. We do a whole, Kristen and I could teach a whole course on that one book. So we're going to move on. We wanted to quickly just talk a little bit about like some, I would say like some misinformation, or some
Mhm.
like strange takes on Hecate that kind of float around. Um, and that these takes were kind of, I believe these takes were really influenced by the Victorian translations of a lot of the Greek and Latin text, and how the
Mhm.
Victorian men who did this understood the world. And it kind of made like, whereas like when we look at what actual classicists and historians um, have written about Hekate Suppers and Hecate, she's complicated. Like
Right.
she is not just a nefarious spirit running around the night, upsetting everybody with a band of evildoers. But there is still this idea, even today, I think, that permeates that that's who she was. And of course, Shakespeare, whether or not it actually was him that wrote the section on Hecate in there, certain on Hecate on Macbeth, that
Mhm.
certainly kind of like helps to perpetuate this idea. But there's a lot of books and things on the internet that
Yeah.
also like help to keep this going. This kind of Hecate is just really super scary. She's gonna get you. You got to do the supper thing, or else looky look, she's gonna track you down, and things are gonna be bad. It's very much like God's gonna smite you down vibes.
Mhm.
And so I picked one example. Kristen had no part in this, so I take full responsibility for this. Um, so there's this book by a folklorist um, that talks about who Hecate was, and right from the get-go, and again, like there's so much misinformation. Hecate's
Right.
married to Hades. No, she's not. Um, and but he does talk about Hecate's suppers and placate her if and when she appeared with her hounds of hell. And like hellhounds to us is something really different than to the ancient Greeks and Romans. First of all, they're like, like Tartaros would have been their hell, like, which is a very specific part of the underworld.
Mhm.
Um, but Hecate was not at all like her hellhounds were about liminality and getting in and out of the underworld, and weren't like this. So it's like trying to make Hecate in this to this monster thing that
Right.
it bugs me. It's like, yes,
Yeah.
she has scary aspects, but if you are trying to be historically accurate at all, and do the work, then you'll see like it's more complicated than that. Though he
Right.
does say that, there was offerings in this Hekate supper, but then he said this thing, and this is why I was like, Kristen, have you ever heard of this in all the research we've done? Chicken hearts and onions.
Never heard of chicken hearts.
So we are doing all of this research on ancient Greek and Roman cuisine, and garlic, yes, but even onions weren't super popular. But I have, like, I'm thinking of Apicius's recipes. Like, I can't even think of one off the top of my head that involves chicken hearts. Like, not even in a
No.
Hecate supper. Forget about it. That is nowhere in the historical record. But
Well, sorry, consider this too. I mean, is that chickens weren't super common anyway. Like the fowl that they kept and were eating and using the eggs from were like peacocks and quail, and like chickens weren't really like chickens were around, but they weren't really a thing.
right,
Like
they were
chicken,
for eggs because I mean, like the research does show they ate chicken eggs.
yeah.
Like in ancient Greece and ancient Rome, they ate chicken
Right,
eggs. I mean, they ate different types of eggs as well, but they did eat
right.
chicken eggs. And I think I read somewhere that like the chickens they had were very different like than the chickens we eat today, and they weren't
Hmm.
really something you'd want to eat anyway.
Hmm.
That they were more for like the egg business, because
Right,
and
egg
plus they
production.
liked other fowl better, like what you meant, like
Right,
quail and even flamingo and peacocks, like they ate different fowl.
right.
So anyway, and then this business about sacrifices of black puppies, 100% historically accurate. Little baby goats, I think it's mentioned once or twice. The puppies in multiple sources. This business that infant girls were sacrificed to Hecate. I have never ever
No,
read that in any like actual serious writing about Hecate supper.
never.
But this is how things get started. You
Hmm.
know, like Hecate was so scary, and it's like this guy is
Hmm.
just pulling from select sources anyway. Like there's this long history of really like hating on Hecate, and because she represented like the underworld, magic, the liminal space. Like there's this whole thing that really, with the rise of Christianity and starting with Eusebius and his early propaganda against paganism and pro-Christianity, like starting at the, when I think that's like the third or fourth century, this long history of like hating on Hecate and trying to make her seem evil.
Hmm.
And, it really carries over into this book that I think came out like 15 years ago.
Right.
And if that's what you believe, that's fine. But if you're trying to look at the history, that's not at all what the ancients would have seen Hecate as. Complicated, yes, but
Hmm.
not anyway. I don't know. These things just get on my nerves. He does have an interesting note on which I don't even know if this is cultural appropriation or what the hell's happening, but he does briefly talk about eggs and Hecate and the cosmic egg, which that's not just from indigenous peoples of North America. It's like all around the world, like the cosmic egg, and even the Sibyls, like the Sibyls of Apollo at Delphi. There's like a giant egg there. So like
Right.
this cosmic egg that birthed the world is like that's also involved in like the spiritual kind of philosophical sense of egg, at the higher level of egg symbolism, there's that.
Hmm.
um, I just wanted to, while we are on the topic of translations by the Victorians and books the Victorians wrote about ancient Greece and Rome and how they are so influential today, here's another one. And so this is Modern Greek Folklore and Ancient Greek Religion. It's a really interesting little book. It is part of the Gutenberg project, so you can read the whole thing for free online if you're interested in this. And in this book, there is reference to the ancient Hekate Suppers, and in Anatolia, the Lady Beautiful is quick to avenge a slight or an intrusion. So what this author is saying, so this book I think was written like 110 years ago, based on like Lawson's experiences of seeing like how these things were still alive in Greek folklore and practices today. And so he says, you know, like there are still hangovers of ancient Hekate suppers in practices that he saw in the ancient Mediterranean, in modern Greece, that were based in the practices that come all the way from ancient days. And then he also makes an interesting connection with Lent, which, given that we've just gone through Easter when we're recording this, and to me, it's like Lent is this period where you abstain from most animal products, but also like other things like olive oil, that this is like connected to the Orphic practice of abstaining from these things, or what went on at the Eleusinian mysteries, and that just situating that beside like that all of these things were offered to Hecate. So it's like we need to be pured, we need to deny ourselves of these things, and to please Hecate, we give her all of these things. I don't know. I think there's something there in that connection.
There's definitely something there. Yeah, there's something there.
And the idea of Lent. Have you ever done like a devotional cycle where you give up something?
And I do this pretty regularly. Yeah, usually during the Deipnon, part of my offering is to give up an unhealthy habit and adopt a healthy one. And sometimes it's simple, like sometimes I'll give up caffeine, or like I'll give up sodas, or I'll only drink water for a month, you know, but it's something that I practice personally. Yeah.
Yeah, I do that a lot too. And you know, again, that's like purification, right? That's lustral. Like if you're giving up something that pollutes your body, like so it gives, you know, it gets back into that energy. I do that a lot too. Like I don't drink caffeine, but I will do something in my diet, like, you know, low sugar for a month, or none of this for a month, or no chips for a month. Like I will just, I don't know, for me, like because Hekate Supper is so associated with food, I like to do something with food most months. Though sometimes I'll do it with something more personal, like, I don't know, I'll do squats every day or something.
Right.
That I wouldn't normally do.
I do that too.
Do the squats instead of eating the peanut butter straight from the jar.
Right.
Which links us back to what the Orphics were doing. And it's not to say that like Hekate suppers were linked directly to the Orphics. It's just to kind of like to give us a landscape for understanding what might have been going through their minds based on what was common in their society at the time. Okay. So we're gonna spend the next little bit as we wind down this talk, kind of making some links between eggs and Hekate supper and Christianity. Like I said, it was recently Easter when we're recording this, and we've been having a lot of talks about this because eggs are really central. If you are watching and you can see like Jesus on the egg here, and these eggs that were in Hecate's supper. So there's a picture that is another Hecateon that is in the Vatican, actually, in the Vatican Museum, which I think is interesting, that Hecate is in the Vatican Museum.
Right.
And it's a bigger one too. It's not a small one. Like most of them are small, but that's quite tall. This whole thing about like eggs as a symbol of resurrection, which I find is so interesting, because that's like different than what the Greeks and Romans, I guess early Romans before they converted to Christianity, like, but eggs were really associated with death for them, right? I think we've made a really strong case. Like eggs are chthonic. They were given to Hecate. They were given to the dead. Like, you know, like there is this, eggs are very much associated with the dead and rebirth.
Right.
and then they kind of get transferred to Jesus in his resurrection. But there's also like this idea, like through Jesus's resurrection, we can all be purified of our sins, like that. Like in the church I was raised in, it's like because Jesus died for our sins. So like Jesus was, his sacrifice was super apotropaic. Like he died himself. And now if we are faithful and, are born again, or in the Catholic Church, they do this differently, but, like through formal rituals, but in the church I was raised in, it was through, like spiritual experiences,
Mm-hmm.
that we are purified and born again, like as cleansed beings, like through this experience, which is different, of course, than what would have been going on in ancient Hekate Suppers, but also not really.
Right. Right. It's different, but it's not. And we were talking about this earlier. I was saying like these ancient Hecate suppers were more, I mean, yes, they were more like a maintenance, right? Um, if you see miasma and sin as like equal to each other, which I mean basically they are.
Mhm.
So this is more like maintenance, whereas in Christianity, you're looking at like an eternal afterlife, right?
Right. Instead of like, this is just going to get me through the month. I'm going to
Right,
keep like the restless dead away from me. The bad stuff is it's like an insurance policy for the month, like a monthly pre-authorized insurance payment.
right.
Um, versus like a one and done kind of thing. Like once I do baptism, I think is a big one in the Christian church,
Uh-huh.
right? You do baptism, then you're good. Like you don't have to do it
Mhm,
every month. So in a
mhm,
way, it's a little easier.
mhm.
But then you're supposed to go to confession, and I don't know, it was really unclear. Like in the Pentecostal church I was raised in, like you just basically said a few words and Jesus forgave you. Like whatever you did, like on Saturday night, like showing up in church on Sunday morning on did all of that.
Right. Just show up.
Just show up. Jesus take care of it. Like whatever you
Mhm.
did that has polluted you,
Right.
just showing up's going to get rid of it. You don't even have to make a meal. You can show up.
Mhm.
But then like communion, like so it's different like with communion in the Christian faith for the different denominations that do communion, that is like you're symbolically consuming Jesus every month. So like Jesus gives you a meal. Instead of leaving Jesus a meal, Jesus gives you a meal every month. I don't know. I just think it's so interesting. And like we are not hating on Christianity, but I like to
Yeah, not at all.
see like the parallels in practices. Like what is this actually about?
Right. Right. It's so fascinating.
So, like in the church I went to, we did like monthly communion on the first Sunday of the month.
Hmm.
So that was like a booster shot or a purification and protection kind of ritual.
Hmm.
I think the Catholics do it every week. I always thought that was weird. It's like,
Um, yeah, I don't know why. Like it just sometimes I miss the obvious. Like this whole idea of like the tomb as the egg, right?
yeah,
Um, yeah, yeah. There's so much there.
there is so much here. So hopefully we've inspired you to think a little bit about this. Um, and everything is linked in the slides. So like I said, if you're just listening to this, you'll be able to find the slides linked on the notes. And if you're watching this, you could also download the PDF of the slides to have a really good look at them. Okay, so we're finishing up with Mary Magdalene, because I find her so interesting because for me, like in looking at how like the early Christians, so those Romans and others, like who adopted Christianity and made it like institutionalized it, like
Hmm.
the stories they told and how the sacred feminine, how the goddess found her voice in this very kind of like male dominated. I mean, the world had always been male dominated, but I'm just saying, like, this was like one God, and he had one son named Jesus, and this is how things are, this is how things work. It was very different than like having dozens and dozens of deities. Even if the boss god was a guy, there was a lot of female deities floating around. And in Christianity, of course, like the saints in Catholicism can be like an analog of a way where the sacred feminine, finds her expression. But in the
Mm-hmm.
Bible, there is like the story of the three Marys. So I won't get too much into that story, but there's Mary, Jesus's mother. Everybody knows her. And we did an episode at Christmas time about the Black Madonna. So if you haven't seen that, you might want to go back and watch that. But Mary Magdalene, she's just an endlessly intriguing character for me,
Agreed.
because it's like sometimes I think I could spend years studying her, like the way I've
Mm-hmm.
studied Hecate, because like I want to actually look at the Greek of the New Testament where she is described, and I want to
Mm-hmm.
actually know the words that were used to describe, like, for her story, compared
Right.
to like how it was translated into English, like in the King James version, for example. Like I want to know how much spin
Right.
doctoring has been done on that, because I know like even things I've like just little things about the Bible that I've been curious about, when you actually look at the Greek, it's like, oh, that's not what that was said at all. Like Jesus, like sin is something completely different. It's basically miasma. But then sin became
Right.
this whole, I mean, it is like miasma, but it's like the whole idea, Jesus was talking about purifying yourself. It wasn't like you were going to hell because you had sex with your boyfriend in the car when you were 16 and you weren't married. Like it's a very different thing that Jesus was saying
Right.
when you actually look at the Greek. So Mary Magdalene, like I feel like I could dedicate a huge chunk of my life to her. I wanted
Mm-hmm.
to bring her in because, of course, when we're talking about these Hekate suppers and eggs, we're talking about um, propitiation, but we're really talking about like apotropaic magic and cleansing rituals for getting rid of miasma or pollution. And where in the popular translations of the New Testament, she is portrayed like as this reformed um, sex worker, basically,
Mm-hmm.
who gets the shine on for Jesus. Um, and then, like in early, this is where things get really interesting. And then in early Christian lore, she becomes like a disciple of Jesus and evangelizes Jesus throughout the ancient Roman Empire. Like there's a lot, I know there's a lot to take in. Like there's also like there's kind of like that surface level interpretation where, okay, so she was a woman in charge of her own sexuality, Jesus came to town, fixed her of that, she became chaste, and went around saying everybody should join the Jesus Club. um, but there's also like she has agency in this story. Like it's a really it's like Mary Magdalene is like Hecate, that she's super complicated.
Right.
um, so I featured these pictures. So one is more like historical, and one is a modern icon of Mary Magdalene. And she is often portrayed with having an egg. And there is a cool story that we're winding things down here. So there's this really cool story. I'll just take a few seconds on it. Where so Mary Magdalene is off like spreading the good word of Jesus. And she gets to, who is it? The Roman Empire emperor at the time. All right.
Yeah.
Who,
Hit a wall.
what's his name? He hit a wall too. It's like, what is his
Yeah.
name? Okay, doesn't matter what his name is. Off she goes. She gives him. He says, this emperor guy says, "I will never ever become a Christian. You're foolish." And she gives him an egg, and he says, "Christ has no more risen than this egg is red." And that poof, the egg turned red. We could do probably at least 60 minutes on how the egg could have turned red. Had a little bit of red mullet juice on it. Um,
Mm.
So, and then there's also the thing where when Jesus was in the tomb before he was resurrected, that Mary Magdalene brought eggs, cooked eggs, to Jesus. So there's all this business with Mary Magdalene and eggs, specifically red eggs. And you've done like some initial research on that, right? Like that the red egg thing, like it didn't start with this story. It was much older.
Yeah, it is much older, and it's something you know, yeah, I've done a lot of research and I haven't found a lot of results, but I did trace the red eggs back to ancient Greece. And they were used as a form of protection. And that's all that I know. That's all that I've been able to find.
So there is, so I was like, well, have Christians used eggs like this, like as a form of this ancient use of eggs where it's like they get the miasma? So indeed, for the Roman ritual, which comes from 1610, there is like a blessing, like this idea of blessing eggs. And so eggs are really like, eggs didn't stop being treated the same way when Christianity became dominant in the West. It's just, it looks a little bit different what we do with eggs.
Mhm.
That's just like the picture is my take on like one of the Roman kind of polenta egg dishes. That's what that is. Um, So here, if you want to go more into the history of the Easter eggs, you can see the link here. I love these eggs. They're gorgeous.
They're
And
gorgeous.
there's lots about Easter eggs and so on. I wanted to just finish with a couple of notes that of things that we found just to kind of reinforce this idea about eggs being used, that they were chthonic, that they were used in burial rites, and that this kind of solidifies Hecate's role as the liminal one who brought souls both to and from this world. So this is a really interesting piece of archaeology that was found, that these 1700-year-old Roman eggs were discovered by archaeologists recently. I don't know, I found this super fascinating that eggs could live for 1700 years, and indeed
Yeah.
they have.
Yeah.
And they were thrown in wells. So that links way back to what Kristen found in the book by Parker
Mm-hmm.
on miasma and how eggs were thrown into wells for cleansing.
Mm-hmm.
So throwing eggs into wells being seen as the gate to the underworld, and
Mm-hmm.
eggs being offerings to the dead, and also a way to get rid of personal miasma. So interesting. Um, and then that is just a really cool vintage Easter card that I think looks super witchy. And she's out with her eggs under the full moon. There was another source. I wanted to quickly mention this. I kind of skipped over this one. That archaeologists have found burials of small children holding eggs. So it just reinforces kind of that story that eggs were associated with the afterlife in
Mm-hmm.
really important ways to the ancient Romans and the ancient Greeks. Maybe we'll end with this quote. The egg, Swedish philologist M.P. Nilsson wrote in his 1907 book on eggs in ancient times, is an apparently animate and inert substance that carries within itself a potent principle of life, and that which has a special vital power must perforce awake or enhance the vital powers of those to whom it is offered. The egg was very important to the ancients, and I hope this has inspired you to maybe connect with doing your own Hekate supper, to see eggs a little bit differently, maybe even learn how to do like a cleansing ritual yourself. We talked to someone whose cultural practice includes like an egg cleansing. So you can look that up online as well. Eggs are really fascinating. And I guess our ultimate hope in doing this is to just share the richness of food as something that is deeply spiritual and transformative and much more than just something we eat to get nutrition.
Yes.
Thanks so much for watching. To learn more about my teaching and writing, you can go to keepingyourkeys.com. And if you've enjoyed this episode, make sure to rate and review. It's so super helpful. And as always, Hail Hecate.